Right, so welcome to the second lecture of week 4 of Philosophy 1500.02, Introduction to Logic Online. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at some harder symbolizations than we did last time, right? But we'll be picking up basically where we left off. What makes these symbolizations harder, right, is that they have, in many cases, multiple, more than two, or in most cases, more than three symbols that we have to use. Symbols are our logical operators. Right, so we're going to look at some tricks for symbolizing, right? Hopefully you find it helpful. One thing I should have mentioned in the last lecture but didn't, right, and it's really important, right, is that you actually practice this material on your own, right? So I've posted the answer key for Chapter 6, right? So do the relevant practice program or problems, right? If you don't, right, this is going to be really, really, really hard, and you will not succeed. Sorry, I just realized I had to plug in my computer. But I'm back. Okay, so to reiterate, make sure you practice these, right? This is hard. It's a skill. All right, so as a review from last time, we have our symbols, right, our logical operators, the tilde, the dot, the wedge, the horseshoe, and the triple bar or biconditional, right? And these correspond to ordinary language words and phrases, right? So the tilde corresponds to words like not, or it's not the case that, or it's false that. The dot to and, or both and, or but, or yet, or nevertheless, or still. The wedge to or either or unless. The horseshoe to if then, only if, provided that, it's necessary, or it's a necessary condition that, or it's a sufficient condition that, right? And finally, the triple bar to if and only if, right? So this is I think a different table than the one in your book. So compare them to one another, see what the differences are. Sometimes one will have words on it that the other doesn't, but they're all like right? They're just different. Right, so one thing that I like to do when I'm symbolizing these things, or one thing that I find helpful, and perhaps you'll find it helpful as well, right, is to go through and mark up the sentence before I try to symbolize it. Right, so what I mean by that is that I would put the logical operator that corresponds to the English word above the English word. So in this case, we have Arizona has a national park, but Nebraska does not. Okay, so when you read this, right, take a step back and try to identify which words correspond to logical operators. So one that does is but, right, and this is the same as and, right, so we'll put a dot above but. Are there any others? Well, there are, right? There's at least one. In fact, there is exactly one. Not, right? So we have this statement, Nebraska does not what, have a national park? And that's the negation, right, of Nebraska does have a national park, or Nebraska has a national park, right? So put a tilde above not. Okay, so now we go through and we assign sentence letters to stand for the statement. So Arizona has a national park. Let's just say that's A. Right, and we have Nebraska does, or Nebraska has a national park is what that means, right? So we use an N. So now we should have something like A dot N tilde above the sentence. Well, we know that's not well formed, right? Because the tilde goes on the left-hand side of what it negates, right? So then we would just rearrange things so that we have A dot tilde N. All right, here's another harder one. So Bill Gates does not support malaria research unless Warren Buffett does not. Well, does not what? Support malaria research. Okay, so same thing, right? We're going to go through and we're going to put our symbols above their English equivalents, or what they stand for in English. So one to start with is unless, right? We know that's the same as either or, right? So let's put a wedge above that. There are a couple nots in there. We can put some tildes above those. And once we've got all those, that's it. Right, so now we should put in some sentence letters. So we have Bill Gates does support malaria research, so we'll put a B there, right? And of course it goes on the right-hand side of the tilde. right? And then we have Warren Buffett does blah, 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 support malaria research, right? So we'll use W for that. And of course, it goes on the right-hand side of the tilde, right? And the wedge, right, the or, the unless, right, this sort of pulls them together into one big super statement, right? So it's not the case that Bill Gates supports malaria research unless Warren Buffett does not support malaria research or something like that. So then we'll have tilde B, wedge, tilde W. Right, so here's a much harder one than we've looked at, but we will build it in steps. Right, so either we will go to the store or we will not go to the store, but we will not go to the park. So one thing that's important here is to note the placement of commas, right, when they come between complete sentences or independent clauses, as you might have heard them called in high school. Right, so what this means is that we're going to use some parentheses, right, and we're going to use it to sort of group things together that belong together according to the sentence that we're trying to symbolize. So let's start with everything to the left of the comma. So either we will go to the store or we will not go to the store. So again, go through, put your symbols where they need to go, right? So with or, we're going to put a wedge, right? And of course that or is attached to either, right? But don't put a wedge above either. Right? Not, and we will not go to the store, right? So we'll use a tilde there. So we will go to the store or we will not go to the store, right? So we will go to the store, let's just use S. We will not go to the store, well, we already have our tilde, so that leaves us with we will go to the store. Actually, I see a typo there, sorry. We will go to the store, we'll use an S there. And that gives us S, wedge, tilde, S. Okay, so that's the first part. Now we have the second part, but we will not go to the park. Well, what is but? Well, it's the dot, right? And we have a not again, so let's use a tilde. Right, so we want to put the stuff to the left of the comma together, and we do that with parentheses. So we move from our first step to our second, right? And then we have this other stuff, this dot, tilde, P, right? And we're just going to shove that onto the end. Right, and that gives us our third step there, left parentheses S, wedge, tilde, S, right parenthesis, dot, tilde, P. Okay, so the last one we looked at was very stilted. Of course, people don't speak like that. They'd say something more like this, we'll go to the store or we won't, but we won't go to the park. Right, but this is symbolized in the same way, right? So either we will go to the store or we will not go to the store, but we will not go to the park. Right, so I made a little bit of like heavy weather about the comma. So compare these two sentences. Saturn has rings, comma, and Neptune is windy or Jupiter is massive. Versus Saturn has rings and Neptune is windy or Jupiter is massive. Okay. So we've said that the commas allow us to group statements together. Right, so in this first one, I have S dot left parentheses N wedge J right parentheses, right? And what those parentheses mean, right, is that Neptune is windy and Jupiter is massive go together. Right? Compare that to the placement of the parenthesis, or the comma rather, in the second one. Saturn has rings and Neptune is windy, comma, or Jupiter is massive. And there we have left parenthesis S dot and right parentheses wedge J. Right, so say those two sentences aloud to yourself or, silently to yourself. Right? Do you hear the difference between them? Right? That's the sort of difference we're trying to capture with these parentheses. All right, here's some harder ones. And it also it's also good to show some equivalencies. And we'll get to that in the coming weeks. But look at these three claims. Israel's abandoning its settlements is a necessary condition for the Palestinians declaring an end to hostilities. Israel's abandoning its settlements is a sufficient condition for the Palestinians declaring an end to hostilities. And finally, Israel's abandoning its settlements is a necessary and sufficient condition for the Palestinians declaring an end to hostilities. Also, these are from the book, right? This is not me pontificating or something. Okay, so anyway, one way to think about what's going on here, as we'll see in the coming weeks, right, is that the third statement is the conjunction of the first two, right? That is to say, I triple bar P is the same as if P, then I, and if I, then P. Okay. The other thing to note here, and perhaps more important for our purposes at the moment, right, is the difference between necessary and sufficient. Right, so start with the second one. Israel's abandoning its settlements is a sufficient condition for the Palestinians declaring an end to hostilities. Right, so if something's a sufficient condition for some other thing, it means that if the first thing happens, right, the second one will. Right, so that's why we do I horseshoe P. Right, so if Israel abandons its settlements, then the Palestinians will declare an end to hostilities. Compare that to the first one, right? The only difference here is the difference between necessary and sufficient. Israel's abandoning its settlements is a necessary condition for the Palestinians declaring an end to hostilities, right? So if something's a necessary condition for something else, then if the first thing happens, starting over. So if something's a necessary condition for something else, right, then if the second thing happens, the first thing happens. Right, so here we have P horseshoe I, right? So the necessary and sufficient thing, they're like the other one, they're like one another, only flipped, right? The antecedent of one is the consequent of the other and vice versa. Right, so here's our final one, and it's the craziest, hardest one. Okay. So Cameron Diaz promotes environmental causes if Ben Affleck supports civil liberties, provided that Sean Penn opposes the death penalty. So I've symbolized this S horseshoe left parentheses B horseshoe C right parentheses, where S stands for Sean Penn opposes the death penalty, B stands for Ben Affleck supports civil liberties, and C stands for Cameron Diaz promotes environmental causes. Okay, so why did I symbolize it this way? Well, note where the parentheses is. So C and B are going to go with one another, right? Okay. Now let's tackle that part first. So we have if. So we know that if means that when we have this sentence, Cameron Diaz promotes environmental causes if Ben Affleck supports civil liberties, right? It means that if Ben Affleck supports civil liberties, then Cameron Diaz promotes environmental causes. That is B horseshoe C. Okay, so put parentheses around that. Okay, now we have this provided that Sean Penn opposes the death penalty stuff. Okay, so what does that do? Well, consult your little chart in the book or a few slides back. We know that provided that is going to be symbolized with a horseshoe. Right, so the question is, where do we put it? Well, provided that is the same as if, right? So we have this big stuff about Ben Affleck and Cameron Diaz, and then we're told provided that Sean Penn does this other thing, right? So that means it goes before, right? It's the antecedent of, oddly enough, what's come before in the English sentence, right? So we have S horseshoe left parentheses B horseshoe C right parentheses. Oh, actually, I lied. That was not the last one. We have another one. So Katie Couric and Brooke Baldwin report international news, if and only if Erica Hill and Nora O'Donnell cover political developments. Okay, so what's going on in this one? The idea is that Katie Couric reports international news and Brooke Baldwin report international news are different sentences, but they're meant by the Katie Couric and Brooke Baldwin report international news construction. Right, so we'd break those apart into Katie Couric reports international news and Brooke Baldwin reports international news. Right, and similarly for Erica Hill and Nora O'Donnell. Right, and then we will have if and only if combining those into one big super statement. Right, so I've given some explanations. I hope that they were helpful. You need to read the book. You need to practice. If you want more explanations, I'm happy to do them. So if there's any in the book that you're puzzled by, let me know. But again, just to reiterate where we started, right? These are really hard, right? And they take practice, and you have to be able to actually look at the English words and see and know like what they correspond to, right? So if you don't memorize the chart, right, or practice, this is never going to work, right? You're going to be in a terrible situation. I don't want you to be in a terrible situation, right? So I can't stress this enough. You have to practice this. You have to practice it a lot. Okay. So good luck. Let me know if you have questions. I'm always available to help, right? I can do email, or we can do like Skype, or if you're on campus, I am sometimes on campus, and I will come to campus if I'm available, right, and help you. And if I'm not available, then we can find a time when I am available, right? So please, please, please reach out. I'm here to help you. I want to help you. I want to see you succeed. So anyway, be safe. Be safe. Stay warm, and talk to you next week if I don't talk to you before.